Okay, so the next speaker is Emily Dinham, and she's going to be talking about safer E2E conversational AI. So you have the floor.
Hi, everyone. I'm Emily, and today I'll be presenting Guiding the Release of Safer End-to-End Conversational AI Through Value-Sensitive Design. And this is joint work with Stevie Bergman, Gavin Abercrombie, Shannon Spruitt, Dirk Hulvey, Ilan Barreau, and Verena Reeser. There we go. All right. Just a quick warning, some of these slides contain offensive language for the purposes of demonstrating the problem at hand. A quick overview of my talk. I'll give some background on the problem of safety for end-to-end conversational AI. And then specifically, I'll discuss the problem of releasing unsafe models to the community. And finally, we'll propose a framework for making release decisions. So as we've all learned over the last several years, large seek-to-seek models trained on corpora of human interactions will learn patterns and mimic behaviors therein, like how to have a chit-chat conversation. But also this often includes offensive behavior and other unwanted biases. So the safety of data-driven end-to-end conversational AI models is an unsolved problem. I think this first received mainstream attention with the Microsoft Taybot incident, in which a chatbot was released on Twitter and was learning online from its interactions with humans and quickly learned to spew offensive content. But this problem has continued. So here's an example from the GPT-3 release, and these are some harmful continuations that were posted on Twitter. And in the last few weeks, some of my colleagues at FAIR released Blunderbot 3, and there were many examples of Blunderbot 3 generating unsafe content, probably unsafe content that it learned from its training data, Reddit. And this, for example, is a really interesting one because somebody posted a screenshot of the model suggesting that Donald Trump is still president of the United States, which is a very sensitive political topic. And the reason for this is that the model was trained on data that was fixed in 2019. So at the time, Donald Trump was indeed president of the United States, showcasing the difficulty of solving this problem as language and cultural events provide new context for the usage of language. So this problem has many technical challenges. For one, detecting offensive language requires a high degree of language understanding. It's possible to say something super offensive without using any specifically offensive words. And even if we knew what it meant to be offensive, controlling natural language generation is an unsolved and open problem. And doing this would require a grasp of common sense and cultural norms that are well beyond current capabilities. So for this reason, we'll call the problem AI complete. It also presents a host of social and ethical challenges. For one, the very notion of safety is ill-defined. It's contextual. It varies from culture to culture and person to person. What is offensive to me might not be offensive to you, and vice versa. As I mentioned with the example regarding Donald Trump, the notion of safety shifts over time as language evolves, and new events provide new context for the usage of language. Moreover, I think the downstream effects of this kind of research are uncertain. So we're not really at the stage where we see these large generative models deployed in products with billions of users, but that might be the case one day. And so it's unclear what kind of harms we should expect with these models. Moreover, our values around this problem are changing, uncertain, and often conflicting. So I like this article from Cade Metz in the New York Times, where he writes about the prospect of chatbots for relieving loneliness. But this pits two values into direct conflict with one another. If we were to relieve loneliness through conversational agents, that might compromise the privacy of users who would then be revealing private personal information to a company. There are other kinds of conflict, like competition of resources. So safety isn't the only problem with these models. A lot of attention has been brought to the environmental impact of training these huge models on many GPUs. There's some other examples of conflicting values are disparities between stakeholders. So who bears the costs and who reaps the rewards for training these large models? I think this is particularly relevant with the question of the environmental considerations, as the effects of climate change are often felt in parts of the world that are not reaping the benefits of these models. There are also intertemporal conflicts. So a person may pay the costs and reap rewards at different times. And so all in all, this is a really hard technical and social problem, and we're not even really sure what we're optimizing for. So given the known issues with these models, when should they be released and to whom and under which conditions? So this is what we'll discuss for the rest of the talk. So I want to point out that this problem is not unique to conversational AI and not unique to the AI community in general. So this is a blog post from the Partnership on AI on a similar debate in the virology community about releasing research, which pits the values of open, reproducible research and making research progress against biosecurity concerns. But we see the effect that this is having on the conversational AI community. So this is a blog post on the release of Vina, which is a large-scale end-to-end chatbot model from Google. And the authors note that tackling safety and bias is a key focus. And for that reason, they're not releasing an external research demo or a model checkpoint. So as a result of these concerns, we're seeing that very few models are released to the community, which contributes to increased difficulty and cost of reproducing research. This is particularly concerning as many of the large industry labs are the ones who are doing this kind of research on these large generative models, and that leaves academic labs unable to build off of this work. So here's a tweet from Jason Weston recently on the release of BlenderBot 3, highlighting the problem that the models aren't released in the form of checkpoints. They're also not released in the form of research demos, which would allow people without the technical know-how to interact with the models and gain a sense of their abilities. And furthermore, data from interactions is often not released. So the question we're really going to focus on is, how can I navigate the trade-offs between different values like open reproducible research and ensuring safe use? So we'll propose a framework for making these kinds of research release decisions. And this framework is based off of value-sensitive design, which is an iterative process of conceptual exploration in which you consider the relevant values, stakeholders, and trade-offs you might make, followed by empirical investigation in which you might conduct surveys, interviews, or experimental manipulations to better understand what your values are. And finally, technical investigation, which is an empirical investigation of how your given technology supports or hinders your values. So to ground this framework, I'll discuss two case studies. The first is open sourcing a model to the community. So you might imagine we have some several billion parameter transformer generator model, which is published in peer-reviewed papers. And we'd like to open source the weights of the model to the academic community to allow other folks to build off of this work. In another related case, we might want to release a demo of this model in order to allow non-experts to gain a better sense of the abilities and limitations of these models, as well as to learn from deployment. So here's our framework. I'll go through each of these steps one by one and discuss what they mean. The first step is to consider the intended use. So explicitly stating your intentions for the release, and consider, are my intentions positive, and what does that even mean in this context? And also it's important to consider, what are the unintended uses? So as an example, in the case of open sourcing, our intended use is for researchers to reproduce and build off of this model, whereas an unintended use might be commercial exploration in unsafe settings. In the case of releasing a research demo, we might want to gather data in the wild to improve the model, and increase public awareness of limitations, for example, but we might not want to expose people to potential harms from this model. Related to that, you should also think carefully about the audience. So who's going to use this? Considering, again, both the intended and the unintended audience here. So how big is it? Is it only 10 people who are going to make use of it, or potentially millions or even billions? It's also important to consider the demographic composition, as people might interact with it differently depending on the language they speak or the culture they're from. And for example, will kids use it? And lastly, also, it's important to consider familiarity with NLP and machine learning, something we don't often consider. I think there's been a lot of hype around these large language models in the community, so people may have unrealistic expectations of their abilities, which could lead to harm, for example, when they generate misinformation. So when we open source a model, we're really targeting researchers with knowledge in machine learning and specifically natural language processing. We also note that the model is trained on English data only, which may pose limitations for its use in other languages. Similarly, for the research demo, we have an English-only interface, but we'd like to interact with the general audience. And so it's important to consider how we're going to manage expectations for that broader audience. So now we have an idea of what we want to do, why we want to do it, and who's going to be the audience for this release. And we can start to envision the potential harms and benefits. So this is the conceptual exploration stage of value-sensitive design. I like this thought exercise from the Partnership on AI, which says, how would a science fiction author turn your research into a dystopian novel? It's a little bit dramatic, but I think it's good for brainstorming. Some other examples, so you might investigate similar case studies with known effects. So I think people have started to release impact reports of the release of models. For example, the authors of the GPT paper released several reports describing misuses of the model. And you might also consider consulting subject matter experts. So we can also try to test for potential harms and benefits once we've thought of what they might be. So this is the technical investigation stage of value-sensitive design. You can compute automatic metrics, human evaluations, or dog food testing. The screenshot on the right is a report from SafeDial, which is a previous work where all of the same authors of this paper worked on building benchmarks for detecting safety problems with open domain conversational AI models. Throughout all of these stages, it's important to collect input from community or domain experts outside of your team. It's unlikely that a group of AI researchers are going to have all of the answers to these complex problems. So in the case of open sourcing, you might seek feedback outside of your institution. One good way to do that is through organizing workshops or attending working groups and consulting with stakeholders and advocacy groups. In the case of a research demo, which might have a broader audience, you might consider consulting with expert representatives of different social groups. So probably the most important part of all this is considering which policies could bolster the positive use cases of the release while limiting the negative consequences. So there have been all sorts of different policies deployed over the last few years, like special licenses, releasing by request, stage release strategies, APIs to revoke access, password protection, etc. So in the case of open sourcing, we might consider restrictive licensing so that only research labs can make use of the model. Of course, that won't prohibit unintended uses in all cases, but it might help limit it. And we can consider releasing by request so that we know exactly who is going to have access to our model. And finally, we might consider stage releases of multiple versions. For example, the authors of GPT-2 release smaller versions of the model first, anticipating that they would incur less harm, and therefore they could learn from the smaller releases before releasing the biggest model. In In the case of a research demo, we might limit access to users above a certain age, or we could revoke access if harm is detected and limit access for certain regions or a certain number of people, et cetera. Transparency is really important when doing these releases to help researchers and users reason through the risks of interacting with or using the model. So here's an example of a model card. I think this was a video, but it won't play. So model cards and data sheets for open sourcing are really important. In the case of a research demo, model cards are probably less important. You don't need to talk about the hyperparameters used to train the model, but a more accessible version of this would be really critical. So an accessible summary of techniques for the general public, informed consent on data collection, and also considering the anthropomorphic clues versus misleading users about non-human identity. So clear signals that users are interacting with a bot throughout. And finally, setting up consistent, accessible, reliable processes to capture and remedy unforeseen harms. So again, it's really unlikely that we'll be able to imagine all possible misuses of a model. So figuring out what you're going to do when something bad happens is good to think about beforehand. So in the case of open sourcing, you might encourage and monitor GitHub issues or release updated versions of the model. In the case of a research demo, you might design a UI to enable user feedback, such as with a human in the loop or doing AI alignment directly on the model. So in conclusion, predicting end-to-end conversational AI behavior is difficult. Unknown inputs will steer the model in unpredictable directions. And we have uncertain consequences of this research at different timescales. So we propose a framework of value-sensitive design for model release, illustrated by a few case studies. And the target audience is researchers in the conversational AI community. So thanks very much and happy to answer questions.
Are there questions? Okay. There's some questions.
Yep.
Are you able to bring the mic over?
So, is that working? So obviously this is really, really important work. And I think a lot of people perceive this kind of thing as being either in conflict to research or profit, potentially as well. How do you think that we can transition from people seeing this as a barrier to research to becoming more of a constructive part of doing this research well?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really great question. I think considering the societal impact of our work is not only going to become something that's good to do, but necessary, especially as many major conferences are requiring ethical impact statements. And we've seen that, public reactions to this kind of research might actually inhibit our ability to do it effectively. I think we can think about this as a way to move forward more responsibly. But I also think it's important to consider how we can operationalize some of these ideas to make it easier for researchers to use them and lower the bar for access. So that was kind of the idea with building tooling to make it easy for people to start to measure these different things.
There's another question over there.
Hi, Ravi from Queen Mary University. So one question. So if you put like this type of things, and then it will become one sort of measure we use accuracy, and then people will more or less copy pasting that. So how you're thinking in that direction, how to resolve that sort of issue?
Yeah, so just to clarify, so the question was around like, how do we make this something that people actually engage with versus just copy paste? Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, to some extent, I think it would be natural that people would kind of follow the path of others. I think it's important to kind of learn from the consequences of these choices. So it can't be that everyone makes the same exact decisions and it leads to a horrible situation down the road. But if as a community, we're moving together to kind of revise how we do these things, I think that's ultimately a good thing.
Hi. So at the recent INLG conference, there was a panel on healthcare and natural language generation where some of the panelists were, quite skeptical of the use of open domain models in there. And, the harms are things like you ask the system, should I commit suicide? And said, yeah, that's a great idea. So given some of these serious concerns, what's the case for releasing a general audience demo at all, right? Given you mentioned policies like ways to capture unintended harm and so, but it seems like some of these after the fact things maybe wouldn't be effective given the seriousness of some of these risks.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I do think there's a distinction between a research demo and an actual product that's deployed with some kind of authority or representing the values of any given institution. But I think deploying is important if we're ever going to be able to use these models in production. And we've seen that people have actually already started to do this. So being able to learn online from interactions is going to be critical to make progress. So I think with the BlenderBot 3 release, for example, that team spent a lot of time working on safety. And quickly, once it was deployed, there were a myriad of issues that the team wasn't able to tackle. And so I think the only way to do this is to actually get feedback from real people. But yeah, there are a lot of issues. I think we're far away from being able to use it in a product.
We have one more question back in the top row. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for the talk. So a number of times the companies have issues with bad press when releasing these models. And even with the stated values, let's say even some researchers are discussing these results over Twitter, this can quickly blow up. And that's the major reason they're not willing to share the models. So how do you see we can resolve such issues that the community is more forgiving about these results and works with the companies as well to figure out these issues rather than just discuss them and blast them for it?
Yeah, I think PR concerns are probably very real for a lot of these companies, and that probably does contribute to people not wanting to release it. I think as it becomes more of the norm, people will be more forgiving of the kinds of mistakes that these models make. But this also goes back to kind of explicitly stating your intentions for a release. So if it's just to drive positive PR for a company, that's probably not a very positive use case. So actually drilling down why we want to do this and what we don't want to happen and whether these things are positive in context, I think is important.
Okay, yeah, last question.
It's just a quick comment, really. So as a product producer in this space, we are 100% nervous about this kind of thing. And these issues are the kinds of things that stop us from using, models and systems that are more on the cutting edge day in and day out. And in fact, from my perspective on the business side, it would be fantastic if the discipline of testing and validating models for their behavior, thinking of things like the red teaming paper that came out recently, if that discipline grows, right, the commercial success and viability of these models also grows. So very supportive.
Thanks.
All right. Yeah, thanks again for the talk. Yeah, this concludes the session. So the next item on the schedule is lunch.
So look, if you leave this building and turn left, and you'll see the frontier building up in there. Then there'll be the poster demo session